Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It is another week of brews here on TCGplayer.com. I am Conley Woods, and this week we're looking at spirits. I saw a couple of spirit lists do reasonably well at the GPs this past weekend. Nothing like too exciting, just top 32, I think, in a top 64. But nevertheless, it's one of the more exciting archetypes out of the new set, specifically because of some huge pickups, Mausoleum Wanderer being one of them, Spellcaller being another one. I guess we're technically using Nebelgas Herald, which is out of the new set. Selfless Spirit is out of the new set and very, very important to the deck. We already had Rattle Change. Yeah, I guess those are the big pickups. But that is enough meat inside of the list that it really couldn't exist prior to this. When I look at spirits in the new format, it very much reminds me of fairies. It's obviously not as powerful as fairies. It doesn't have as many individually powerful cards. Fairies had things like Mistbind Click, Spellstar Sprite. It had Jace when the original Planeswalkers were around for a while. Bitter Blossom obviously was absurdly strong. Thoughtseize, Sign of Una, all these very, very powerful cards that were all pretty strong individually, and then when they came together were even more so. Fairies is a really difficult deck to ever top power level wise, but in terms of stylistically, this deck is very, very similar. We want to play things at instant speed for the most part, whenever we can. We want to play things that are disruptive to our opponent while we apply pressure, and we want to kind of explode out of nowhere for damage when we get them sort of weak. One thing that fairies did very well is it would kind of spend the early turns controlling the game, getting in a few bits of damage with a couple of Bitter Blossom tokens or of a Spellstar Sprite or a Mutavault, and then eventually you would be at 14 or something. They would counter one of your spells, end of turn play like a random fairy, untap Sign of Una, activate 2 Mutavaults, and attack you for like between 10 or 14 damage. You might have just died on a spot where you might be at 2 or something. And at that point, the game's over already. Like, they're able to just explode out of nowhere for huge amounts of damage, and really kind of take you by surprise when you don't have a chance to retaliate. And there are enough Anthem effects in the format right now that, at least in this deck, at least in these colors, that I think we can get a similar sort of style. Obviously, again, not quite to the same level of explosiveness, but that's kind of what we're going for. So I've seen one drop lists. I've seen lists that have a lot of different styles to them. One of them ran things like Thraben Inspector. I really wanted to keep my list pretty clean, very heavy on flyers to get through damage, very heavy on disruption, and like I said, try to get that burst damage through. So at the one drop slot, we have 4 Mausoleum Wanderers, which is very, very, very strong in the list. He's arguably the best one drop I've seen out of either of these lists, fairies included. Fairies just didn't really have. I mean, Thoughtseize obviously is a good one drop, but in terms of one drop creatures that apply pressure, Mausoleum Wanderer is probably the best I've seen. Very relevant abilities. Gets large and attacks for 2 often on turn 2. If you play any of your spirits, it gets bigger. Obviously, playing Rattle Chains is not the most exciting thing, but sometimes you will just play it to get in a point of damage, depending on what your hand is. But these guys are all sorcery speeds, so you're willing to go there. Get in a point of damage, has the sacrifice clause to counter something. Also, this is great when played at instant speed via Rattle Chains. You can catch your opponent off guard, kind of force spike something. It's great with Always Watching or the Wyvern, because those are going to pump him up, in addition to spirits at instant speed, which will pump them up. So all kinds of just little synergies with this card. Great all-around one drop, super heavy on utility, and one of the reasons to be playing spirits for sure. Also 3 Essence Flux in here, which is a really interesting card because it's mega utility. Obviously, you use it to counter spells as kind of a negate a lot of the time, but it also provides +1/+1 counter. You get to rebuy, comes into play effects, which is especially important for things like Rattle Chains or Reflector Mage, Nebelgas Herald sometimes, Spellquiller sometimes. So just all around very, very, very strong card that doesn't really see play anywhere, but it really can't see play anywhere else because if you're not getting advantage of that +1/+1 counter at least some of the time, it's kind of one half of a blink for 1 mana is just not that exciting. But in this deck, it's kind of a secret little workhorse. I have the 4th one of them in the board actually, which acts kind of like a turn aside or a negate, so it's over here. Just a great all-around card. Hopefully we'll get to see it in action. I played 2 games prior to this just to test the deck a little bit. and this came up huge for me in both games multiple times. So definitely recommend it. Keep in mind it will also blink things and pump up your Mausoleum Wonder as a result, because it's whenever another spirit enters the battlefield. So you can blink something, you can get the bonus from an Anafenza off the blink. You can, like I said, pump up your Mausoleum Wonder. You can retrigger your Rattle Chains. All kinds of great stuff. 2-drop slot. We have 4 Selfless Spirits. Not much to say about this card. You all seen it in Standard in a million decks. Great all-around card. Just super efficient. Again, high on utility. Great aggressive beater as well. A great card at instant speed via Rattle Chains. You can protect your creatures from Wrath. Just again, not much else to say. Just great card. 2 Anafenzas. I've seen lists that have 3. I've seen lists that have 1. I think you probably want 2. I have 2 because obviously it's legendary, so you can't have 2 of them in play. And it is double white. And while we have let's see, 15 white sources, it's not guaranteed you're going to be able to cast this on turn 2, especially obviously if you cast a Mausoleum Wanderer on turn 1. It's very unlikely for you to cast turn 2 Anafenza. Still a great card, and you want to draw it most games, but I was just a little worried about running 3, so instead I moved the third one over to the Wyvern slot, which we'll get to in a second. But I do think you want a heavy amount of anthems. So we have Anafenza, Always Watching, and Thunderclap Wyvern in terms of our anthems. If you decide to not play the Wyvern, for example, or you decide to play the Always Watchers in the sideboard, both of which I think are reasonable options, then you probably want to add a third Anafenza just to keep your kind of burst damage high. 4 Rattle Chains, bread and butter of the deck, I would say. All of its abilities are just insane. 2 mana, 2/1 Flash Fire, great. Hexproof is often acts like a counterspell, again, great. Even when it doesn't, you don't mind. And then being able to cast spirits as with Flash is just absolutely huge. Like I said, Mausoleum Wanderer is great as a 4 spike out of nowhere. Selfless Spirit's great with the sacrifice to turn your guys indestructible out of nowhere. And obviously your other spirits have Flash in your main deck, but there's a huge spirit in your sideboard that's great with Flash that came up in a game earlier for me, so I want to mention it real quick, and that's Bygone Bishop, which is kind of one of your anti-control cards. You kind of get a ton of card advantage off of it. Really, really awesome card when you get to play this at the end of their turn, untap, and then immediately have access to play more spirits to get an Investigate going. So I was really big fan of this having Flash. Even though it is in the sideboard, it is relevant to mention, I should say. 4 copies of Unsubstantiate. This is something I'm trying that I haven't seen other lists necessarily do, but I really want to give this a shot. It just tempo is soaking from the card. Fairies, I have to imagine, would have played this. They certainly would have played Remand if they could have. This card just a huge amount of tempo. You can use it as a main deck counterspell for literally anything, which is great. The ability to bounce creatures de facto is also nice. Even though you generally want to be hitting a spell when it's on the stack. Obviously, hitting a creature, you have to do that, But often you want to use this for the important, like, non-creature spells and stuff like that. You do have Mausoleum Wanderer to help with non-creature spells, so it's not guaranteed you'll even need Unsubstantiate for, like, a Planeswalker or a Languish or anything of that nature. But it is still a card that, you don't necessarily want to use it on their random Sylvan Advocate or anything like that, because most of your squad flies, and the ones that don't fly, like Reflector Mage, are going to deal with the Sylvan Advocate anyway. So be a little picky with this. You're going to usually play your creatures out first anyway, but just be a little picky with this. Don't necessarily hold it up all the time, and certainly don't just throw it around willy-nilly, because you do want your tempo to go a long way. 3-drop slot, a bunch of familiar faces, 4 Always Watching. I've seen lists without this. I don't know if that's correct, and I think you could theoretically get away with a few less of these because you do have other options in terms of anthems, as we already mentioned, Anafenza and Thunderclap Wyvern. But it's just such a powerful card. Giving your creatures vigilance lets you get around things like Nahiri. Obviously, the Always Watching will die to Nahiri, but that's fine. If they're not killing one of your creatures, they're going to die. This happened to me earlier, that's why I mentioned it. Vigilance also just helps you battle against aggro decks, which is great. Great card with some sideboard options that we have, including things like Gisela against aggro. When Gisela gets +1/+1 and vigilance, it's quite actually just Baneslayer Angel against aggro. So Always Watching, again, I probably don't need to say much about this card. It's dominating a million different decks already. Nebogast Herald is a 2-of in here, mostly because of Reflector Mage kind of covering the deal with creatures duty already. And I thought the Herald was probably a little bit worse. It does work whenever you cast any spirit, so you can get a little bit of chain action going and push through damage when your opponent doesn't expect it. But generally speaking, this is basically what Pestermite was in the fairies list. And if you remember fairies lists, they played Pestamite for the first couple of months, and then they quickly cut it in favor of better cards. And there's a chance that Nebelgas Herald is just is in that category already. But I've seen lists that have 4 of it, so I want to at least give it a shot and try it out. It's a 2 of right now. Reflector Mage, we all know 3 copies of it right now. 4th in the board, mostly because we already have so much of that effect, and we also don't really want ground creatures too much due to most of our squad flying. We can ignore ground creatures, and once we get Reflector Mage in play and we need to push him through for damage, now we kind of have to either have to deal with the ground creature or ignore Reflector Mage as a offensive threat. Both those things are theoretically fine because Reflector Mage is so strong, but I do have the 4th on the board as a result. Again, we have Unsubstantiate to kind of make up for that. We have Essence Flux to blink 1, so we don't necessarily need all 4 copies. 4 Spellquellers, on the other hand, we do need. Also, lucky me, 4-1. I actually opened all these Spellquellers. I have not traded for a single one. I just drafted my butt off and just got a bunch of Spellquellers. But yeah, Spellqueller, Spirit, great, one of the best cards in Standard. I shouldn't need to say much about it. One of the cards that really helps your Collected Company matchup. You have Mausoleum Wanderer and Spellqueller, which counter Collected Company. Unsubstantiate basically counters it. Then you get to basically fight the same fight as them, except all your creatures fly. So I think we win, but I don't know. We'll find out. So yeah, 3-drop slot, 4-drop slot, 2 Adjuctize commands. I'm not certain on this exact number, but I think 2 is pretty reasonable. The Gain 4 life is good. The countering spells is good, obviously. Drawing cards, blah, blah, blah. The returning creature 2 or less, we don't have a million options. We only have really Mausoleum Wanderer, Selfless Spirit, and Rattle Chains, and Anaphenza. So we have 14 total targets, which is not a million by any means, but I think the ability to return Mausoleum Wanderer and Selfless Spirit particularly is, I guess Rattle Chains to a lesser degree, but those 2 cards in particular is just so huge. You can return Rattle Chains at instant speed, so you can use this as a counter target, as basically a turn aside if you have a Rattle Chains in your sideboard. So it can sort of be counter target creature spell or counter target spell that targets a permanent you control, which is nice. But it's also one of our aces in the holes against aggro. Just gaining 4 life and bringing back a threat like a Selfless Spirit is huge. And then 2 Wyverns. This is a little Conley special that I don't expect a lot of other people to try. This card just plays so well in what you're trying to do. It's instant speed, so it works in the same way that a Adjuctize command does, in that if we leave open 4 mana, we can either have a Wyvern and get you, or we can have a command and get you, and you don't really know which one we have. It's also a reasonable threat on its own, something that Always Watching can't claim. 2/3 flyer is fine when you throw it into the context of a very tempo heavy deck. We can't gain any benefits off it from like Rattle Chains or Essence Flux, which is I mean, we could blink it with Essence Flux to save it, but we can't get a counter out of it because it's just a Drake. But what we can do is use it as an Anthem. We can get bonuses to our Mausoleum Wanderer instant speed off of it to surprise an opponent. And we can also, again, trigger Anaphenza instant speed, which is fine. We have Selfless Spirit to help protect it. So I think it's worth having a couple of these. I'm running 2. I could see running 1. I could see running more. I don't know. Maybe this card is better than Always Watching. It could be. Most of our deck flies, besides the 2 Anaphenza and the 3 Reflector Mage. So, you could even theoretically lean a bit heavier on this card. It's one of the cards I'm more excited to try out, and it was pretty good in testing so far. So I'm going to keep at it. Sideboard, 1 Hollow Moonlight for Collected Company, really, and random Reanimator decks, I guess. 1 Collective Effort for Cat Pact and other things. I mean, this card just has a bunch of abilities that are all pretty good in our deck. Killing big things, blowing up enchantments, and then Antheming. 2 Bygone Bishops. Again, against control, you really want to gain card advantage and clue it up a bunch of times. 2 Declaration in Stone to help us out against creatures we need to deal with. 2 Gisellas against the super aggro decks. Usually, I imagine if you land this and you untap with it, the game's going to be over. There is a chance that you land it and they burn it out, but hopefully you have something like Mausoleum Wanderer protecting it, or an Always Watching, pumping it up, or something. A couple Surge of Righteousness, also against aggro, also against mono red, vampires, stuff like that. A little bit of life and a little bit of spot removal. 1 Negate, 1 Turn Aside, 1 Essence Flux, all essentially the same thing, just various counter spells to protect our creatures. 1 Reflector Mage to bring in against the creature heavy decks where we really want another bounce spell, and then 1 Blighted Step as a 23rd land to help us cast our Gisellas in the matchups we want it, and also potentially to cast Bygone Bishops against control, which is why it is a blighted step, so that when we do bring it in against the aggro decks, if we ever do flood out, which would be pretty bad against them, we can cash in, and we draw a blighted step, of course. We can cash this in the mid to late game for 6 to 8 life, which could be absolutely crucial in keeping us alive. And our mana is reasonable enough in the main deck with 7 islands, 7 planes, and then 8 duels. That I think we can get away with a single colorless land in the sideboard. So that is the deck. As I said, I played a couple games with it. It's super fun, super explosive. I won both those games. Hopefully the streak continues for the camera here. And yeah, we'll be right back battling some blue-white spirits in standard. Hopefully we dodge all the bank company. I mean, actually, I think we're going to be pretty good against bank company. So we have so much tempo on them, and then again, all of our things fly, so they can't really interact with us. Regardless, we'll be right back. Conley Woods for TCGplayer.com. Blue White Spirits. Peace.